3.5, maybe a 4 on that. She had a pretty good hurdle, but if you saw, it was a little rushed, a little faster than I would like, and she threw it down too much, which caused her to flip over at the end. You see, it's a little slobby, just not as tight as we would like on that. And see, that's a good example of about a 2 dive right there. Allison has a good hurdle, she's up high, that kind of thing, but no control at the finish. And that's where you see, even if it has very good elements in some other parts to it, it's still very important that you've got to have at least some semblance of control and finish on the dive. More common of some of the dives that we might see. I would go about a 4 on that dive. If you notice, Emily's feet weren't quite to the end of the board, which just shows that she doesn't have quite enough control in her takeoff, which is a major factor there. Ends up making her go down too low. The dive didn't go up very high. And the finish, it was pretty nice, but it wasn't as tight or controlled as we would like to see there. So not a bad dive, but about a 4 is what I would go on that. I would go about a 6, 6.5, and this is a good representation of what I'm talking about. You've got to compare and contrast from various other dives. That dive, if the judges were scoring a lot harder, would only be about a 4.5 or a 5 dive because she was a little bit out and went over a little bit. But relative to the previous dive, which I said was about a 4, that was significantly better. She went up higher. She had a better finish on it. It's clearly a superior dive. This is a good example. First thing you notice there is that would be very questionable, at least, about whether his hands are below his shoulders on that. So that might be 2, but that goes down to the referee. So I'm going to assume that he didn't, and I'm not going to score whether his arms were up or not. That's the referee's decision. I would give that dive a 3 because I like the takeoff. It had good control, but clearly didn't make the dive around well enough. Clearly just didn't have quite enough control on it. That's about a 5.5, maybe a 6 dive. She had pretty good rotation on it. She was pretty high in it. A nice tight hike. There was no bend at the knees, anything like that. Just a little short of vertical. Just didn't quite make the dive all the way around, but a solid dive nonetheless. Be about a 3.5 dive, and sometimes you get into the older kids and people don't want to score them the lower scores, feel like they'll make you feel bad or whatever, but in truth the dive was too far out. He didn't finish it well. It went over on his back a little bit there, and one thing about the dives when they're out in the middle of the pool, it's not only that we're taking off for that part, but it's usually symptomatic of something else that was wrong. Here I'd go about a 5.5 because he lifts up a little higher on it, but more than that, he clearly has better control on the dive, put a better finish, it's more vertical, much more pleasing dive to the eye, I suppose. And now we'll get off onto our back dives a little bit, our back dives, back somersaults, things of that sort. David there, that would be about 3, maybe a 3.5. I like the way he jumped on it. I like that nice tight tuck in it, but he just doesn't come out properly, and so it goes over on his stomach there a little bit. Just not quite enough control on the dive. Here, one thing you're looking for, especially as you see back dives, is whether they go up or whether they just fall off backwards. It's very common to see not see a good arm circle, rather. See, Allison here has a pretty good arm circle, jumps up pretty well. That's why I would go a 5.5, maybe a 6 on that dive. Just a little too far back, just went over a little bit long, but a lot of very nice elements in that dive, and could easily be a 6.5, 7 dive with just a little more vertical. I would go go about a 5 on that as well. She stayed very nice and tight. She was just a little too far back away from the board. One thing though that I would have taken off for a little bit there is if you saw she had a little twister in her body. That's a tough thing to quantify. You can basically take off anywhere from about a half point to 2 points for that. That was a minor one. I would take off about a half. It'd probably be a 5.5 dive or so otherwise. Now Luke there, that's a harder dive to score in my mind. I would go about a 4.5. He jumped up well, he had a nice tight hike in it, but if you saw, he didn't get his arms over his head at all, which basically shows they didn't complete the dive. Bear in mind, I can be a little difficult sometimes, but that gives you representation. That's the thing. You kind of got to see all of the elements in order for it to be considered a pretty good dive, I suppose. Courtney, that's something you're going to see fairly often. It was back dive straight. It wasn't a bad dive. She jumped a little bit, but I would go about a 4, maybe a 4.5 at most, because it went more back than up. You didn't see the lift that we'd like to see on that dive. See, Allison here, that's, again, if we disregard that she had a little bit of hike in the dive, that would be our 6.5, 7, because that's what we're looking to see on a back dive straight, that she jumped up high, she didn't fall back, she had a good takeoff, she didn't stay tight. In this particular case, I would take off fairly substantially because of that little hike in the middle, but as an example, that shows us what we want to see in terms of jumping up and not falling backwards on the beginning of it. Now David shows us right there. He's got his hands over his head, so that's a situation where the referee will call match 2. I would still give it the 2 because he still jumped pretty well. He had a nice tuck in the air. I liked the dive on the whole. He just simply had his hands over his head. That's a situation though where you don't have to feel obligated to automatically give it a 2 in that sort of case. If you thought it was lower, thought it was a 1 dive, that's fine. That's perfectly in your right to do. Now see Anton, we see there, he had his arms down by his side, so he's going to get a little higher scores on that. I would go probably a 4.5 on that. I like the dive, but if you notice right, as he goes in the water, again, we see a pretty good twist on it. And that was a more substantial one than on Taylor's earlier, so I would take off about a 1.5 on that, bringing it down towards about a 4.5. Another thing that we're going to see pretty commonly, back somersault straight. Oftentimes you'll see the young ladies do that dive. Allison does a pretty nice job of jumping up high on that. I would go about a 5.5 probably on that, but again, just a little too much hike to make it a much better score. I would take off about a point or so based on that little bit of hike in the air. Shows us a back 1.5 here. Some of the more advanced kids will do this dive. I would go about a 3 on that because it's just too far back away from the board, and in fact maybe lower as I think about it because his feet were pretty close to hitting the water before his hands do, which of course would be a fail dive. Again, that's a referee's decision on that, but at any time that it's close like that, you certainly don't want to be much above 2.5 or a 3. Shows a very nice back 1.5 tuck. I would go 6.5, maybe even 7 on that, depending on how I was judging that day. It's a little too far back away from the board, but very mechanically sound, very nice tight body line on it. One thing you might notice on the finish there, feet were a little flexed, so I would probably go with that 6.5 rather than the 7. But all in all, a very solid dive. Does a back 1.5 hike. This is something we won't see all the time, all too often. I would go 6.5, a very nice tight body line, a very good dive. Just a little further back. You saw on David's, the previous back 1.5 tuck, stayed a little taller, went up more, not back quite so much. But where Clark gets a little bonus there is that he was tighter in the air, had his feet pointed, that sort of thing. David here's a good example of when you have a good takeoff and yet no entry or the score. He jumps up very well on that. That's very good control. That's a situation where if you're not familiar, you haven't seen a lot of reverse dives and inward dives, you might think that's too close for. But actually, I thought he had very good mechanics on that. However, if you see when he kicks out, there's just not enough control on it, way too loose. I would go 3, maybe a 3.5 on that.